Oh, I just got a message, recording in progress. But I'm sorry, I'm a winter wimp now. And I just thought, man, I'm getting too old for winter. So I thought, okay, coast, let's do the coast. So I am in Gabriola today. I think that's about it. Why don't I start with the plan for today? We have an hour and a half today, 90 minutes today to, what I thought I'd do is do like the foundational stuff, some of like, getting us all on the same page. And I've got all of your questions that you submitted. Thank you for all of them. That's really helpful that I can get to those and bring them in. And oh yeah, and I forgot, and Manisha's reminded everyone about, yes, please do introduce yourself in the chat. And I've got it open now, and I'm going to read all about you and where you are situated right now, where you're from. And yeah, so we'll do some slides today, but I promise we won't do that every time in the next 4 weeks. But we'll start with some slides today. We have a discussion question. You can submit questions or your thoughts, or your, feelings, whatever's going on for you. Want to talk about something, if you're like, yes, that happened to me when I worked here or something, anything like that, any reactions, any questions you have, please feel free to put it in the chat. As I say, I have it open and I will be monitoring that. I will be sharing the slides with Manisha afterwards. So I'm not sure what her system is, but she can get that out to you. So don't feel like you have to take a million notes unless you want to. Some people learn by writing notes. That's cool if you need that, but don't feel like you have to. I'll be sharing those later. And what else do you need to know? Well, before we get into some of the slides and start talking about all of this stuff about, intergenerational trauma, trauma-informed care, we are going to get into trauma-informed self-care for people who work in helper positions. We're going to end our 4th session. It's going to be a little writing workshop that's really aimed at you, the helpers. Having one more thing that you can use in your toolkit to keep yourself healthy and well with the work that you're doing. But it's also something that you can use with clients as well, if you're working with adult clients and, well, young adult clients as well. So we're going to take you through in the next 4 weeks. But why don't I start with a couple of the questions that I thought I'll get to right away before I even open up the slides. One of the questions was, is this all based on reserve? How could I teach what I learn after this? And what I would say to that is intergenerational trauma affects Indigenous peoples living urban, rural, and on reserve. So there's no real difference, and anybody working in an agency or in a helper position, if you're a social worker, a mental health worker, a community support worker, whatever your position is, an educator perhaps, your approaches are not going to be any different depending on where you or we or a client or a colleague is, right? There are, of course, particular contexts to a person's story. And in the next session next week, we're going to talk about stories and how stories make people and how we can reshape our stories and the stories of our clients to help, bring in that healing pedagogy. It's a big word, but, a healing approach to the work. But yeah, there's no real, there are residential school survivors living on reserve. They're also living in cities. There are families that have been split by, colonial policies, such as the foster care system or the adoption system, and they live in all sorts of different contexts as well, right? So it's not really based anywhere. It is specific to Indigenous peoples, though, and that was another question. I think it's on the last page here. Yes, is this Indigenous specific? I would say yes, for the next 4 sessions, and not to be weird, but also no, because trauma is pervasive in society. And there are certain reasons why I use the Indigenous specific context here today, because there are things we need to know about Indigenous lives in Canada, what we've all been through and what we're dealing with today. But, you know, the theory, you know, about being trauma informed and, you know, how we can help both ourselves and our clients heal, that really doesn't change from person to person. Again, it's just about knowing the story and the context. So I will be, you know, most of the time talking about the specific Indigenous context, but being trauma informed and doing self-care for yourself, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, these things, some of the exercises and activities we'll be getting into, I'm not sure now, is it week 2 or week 3? I'll have to check the schedule. You know, they're good for everyone. So don't worry about that. It's whoever you are, we welcome you into the circle, right? And you're going to find what you need out of the sessions, and you can apply it in the context that you're working at. So we're just happy you're here. And then there was another question, is this for professionals? Yes, but also no. You know, if you're a community member and you want to know more about this, this is great. Because yes, starting next week and possibly into week 3, again, I'll have to check the schedule. We are going to be talking about some stuff, you know, activities and exercises that, just like I said with the writing workshop, there are things that you can use for clients, but there are also things that you can use for you, right? So anybody, again, is welcome in this circle, because you can use it for others, you can use it for yourself. This material, you can develop understanding for your own situation, and you can understand other people's situations with it, right? So great questions, and it helps us, you know, get off on the right foot. So, and I think this is sort of the same question. Can the activities be used for any populations? I think so, yes. These are, you know, what we're going to be talking about next week and in week 3 as well. Some of the exercises and activities, you know, these are things I've used in different agencies where I've worked. So not just with Indigenous people. I think that's it oh no, there's one more that I thought was like a good starting question. Will culture be introduced in the program? I will say yes, as far as I'm able to do that. You know, I only know what I know, right? I'm 55 now. Like I said, I don't know when that happened. And I'm very, 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 very grateful to have worked with, you know, like elders and residents at some of the agencies that I worked at. And I'm very grateful to have read the work of other Indigenous writers and to have learned from others, right? To have learned within community. And I once said to an elder that I work with sometimes, Michael Frasher, I said to him, who am I to be passing along anything? Who gave me permission to do this? Like, who am I? I don't know anything, right? I'm relearning. I'm still walking my own healing path. Who the heck am I to even be thinking I should be passing anything on? This is when I was writing the book Legacy. And he just told me straight up, he said, Suzanne, knowledge is a group resource. If you know something, it's your duty to pass it on, because that's how we help each other. That's part of reciprocity. And I was like, oh, okay then. So culture will be included, but it's you know, the little bits that I know, right? And of course, I will encourage you, if you feel like contributing your thoughts. That's what the chat is there for. Okay, I think that's it for like intro questions. Okay, so let me open up. I'll share the screen and I'll open up some slides. And, you know, I do this work, I hope you can all see that. I do this work as a living. So let me start by saying, well, I don't do it as a living. Like I do it for like, because it needs to be done, right? And we need to talk about this as a community, as communities, and as Indigenous people and living in the dominant society. We need to talk about it with dominant society systems and institutions as well. It needs to be done. But you know, I do these events and I write books. It's kind of my work in the world is what I mean, right? It's the way I live every day is thinking about these issues. But I recognize that for some people, this might be, you know, there could be something on a slide, or there could be, you know, at the end of today, after 90 minutes, you might feel like, oh my gosh, that was a lot. It's okay to feel that way. And I will not be offended if you turn off the camera and you need to go take a break, get a glass of water. There's no real like triggers or anything here, I don't think. But you know, I just kind of go now. I'm so comfortable kind of talking about this. I just go. So I'm just gonna go. But I want you to know that I am thinking of you and sending positive energy, because I know that, you know, there could be something where you will go, oh, wow. And it might be a moment for you. So I'm going to try to hold that space for us, that we can all be where we are at. This is difficult things. This, you know, this material can be difficult. We're going to go, we're going to get to it, but I recognize that it's pretty deep sometimes. Yeah. So this slide, as you can see, is a big river, and that is the Peace River. So that is the actual site. And before I talk about anything at most events, I want to always start with the land, because this is where I grew up. And I could just spend 90 minutes looking at this photo, actually, but I'm sure you'd prefer that we didn't. Sagatawa means where the rivers meet, right? So at the top of the screen there, that's the Smoky River. It begins in the Rocky Mountains in BC, right, on the BC side. And then sort of like to the left there, off the left of the screen, and you can't really see the water so much. That's the Smoky River, and that begins in the Rockies around Jasper. And it flows up, they meet right here at Sagatawa, and then sort of off the screen to the right, and it's going to be sort of, you can't see the little bridge, but that's the town site. And that's also where the Heart River enters the Peace. So there are 3 rivers that meet in this place. And so Sagatawa, the first slide here, this is the ancient gathering site where, you know, as I said, the shared territory where we all used to meet, you know, and the rivers, of course, were our highways. And this is where we had governance sessions. This is where we had conflict resolution. We would have ceremonies. We would have family celebrations. I'm sure there was more than a few marriages, meeting new people, that sort of thing. This is also where the explorer Alexander Mackenzie landed in 1792. It was right here at the site at Sagatawa. And then next slide, that town site. So, you know, settlers recognized a very good thing when they saw it, which was the beauty and the abundance of this place. So they put the settler town right there, a little bit down. Well, it's upriver, right? But it's down. I think of it as down somehow from the site of Sagatawa. Well, a little bit away, let's say, from the actual site of Sagatawa. So I grew up here in Peace River, and I just want to acknowledge the gifts that that land gave me and the things that I learned. And I guess it occurs to me too to say that Peace River is a small town, but it's one of those mixed towns, like the PA or like other places on the prairies, where, you know, there's lots of Indigenous people and lots of, you know, white people and some newcomers as well. Mostly there was Chinese families with restaurants and businesses. There was some Mennonites who had come later than some of the original settlers, but it was a mixed town. And it was in that way incredibly racist, because of course there were power dynamics and who had the power and whose stories were sort of honored and heard and seen. But there were always people who did see and acknowledge the Indigenous history of the area. And there were lots of Indigenous families, of course. And so I spent some time at the Sakatawa Friendship Center, you know, trying to be in that place, because sometimes Peace River was a little bit hard to be in, feeling unseen and unheard. But there was a lot of cross communication as well, and certainly a lot of intermarriage. Yes. So that is where I'm from, and I just want to say hello to that land. So let's get right into some of the theory. There are a couple, probably 4, 5, 6 now, different types of trauma. So when we talk about trauma, intergenerational trauma, you know, there are things that we need to make sure we're all on the same page with. So when we speak about intergenerational trauma, that's really when trauma is passed from one generation to the next. And how that usually happens is not because it's, you know, sort of the fault of the survivor who has experienced trauma and then like willfully passing it down to their children. No, it's actually a lack of support for healing. So when, as has happened with Indigenous peoples, when there's a lack of support in society or in the systems and institutions of a society for healing, then, you know, we develop coping skills that help us survive. But those coping skills sometimes affect our parenting skills and our adult relationships, right? And so that's how our coping skills, our way of being in the world, those skills get handed down and they create resiliencies. But at the same time, we're handing down that sort of survivor's way of being in the world, which also passes down the trauma, right? And those lack of supports just mean that, you know, survivors, we're doing the best we can. We're raising families, we're contributing to our communities, but we're carrying a lot of unresolved emotions and a lot of stuff that we haven't sort of been able to process and understand, right? And then there's also, and someone did submit a question around PTSD, there is definitely some studies out there that talk about the experience of residential schools, and then survivors, it can definitely be seen to be experiencing PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I talk a lot in my work about complex PTSD. So there's something called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And because PTSD really speaks about one experience or a series of experiences in one situation. So that's why when, you know, soldiers come home from war, they may have been there for a year or two and had more than one experience that was, you know, beyond their ability to cope, which is what really a traumatic situation is. But it's within that one context, right? So then they come back home, and then the problem starts to be, not that they're the problem, but then problems start to happen because, you know, they're not in the war anymore in that context, but they're back in so-called normal everyday life. But they're still acting like they're at war because they're still like hypervigilant, you know, waiting for the next thing to happen, bad thing to happen, bomb to drop, or they're still in their survival, you know, coping skills, right? But it's still sort of one context. Now, PTSD, you might be aware, can also happen like someone might be the victim of a crime, and that really might have stressed them out and be beyond their ability to cope at that moment as well. You can develop post-traumatic stress disorder after being victimized, especially if it's an interpersonal crime like sexual assault or, you know, attempted murder or something like this. You can go on, but PTSD is very specific in that way, in that it's talking about one experience or maybe a few experiences, but it's like one situation. And I really like the complex post-traumatic stress disorder because it really speaks to experiencing things that are beyond your ability to cope repeatedly, over and over during your life, starting in childhood and continuing throughout life. So it's repeated, it's prolonged, and it's also within complex trauma, is within this whole context of subordination or oppression or control. And I should say here that all of these things are, recognized in the sort of newish last 20, 30, almost 40 years now, area of like trauma studies. But none of this is really new, right? Because when soldiers were coming back after World War I and they had shell shock, if you've ever heard that term, that was of course PTSD, but it wasn't called that then. So we've known since at least World War I, so 100+ years, that when something happens to you and it's beyond your ability to cope, you're going to have issues coping in the so-called normal everyday world, right? But complex trauma came about through the scholarship of a woman called Judith Lewis Herman. And I have a book by her on my shelf here. It's called Trauma and Recovery. And it first came out in, was it 92 or 97? And she just put out a new book, I think last year, 2023. This is a foundational text. I read it long before I started considering intergenerational trauma, but then I started, when I was reading this, realizing, well, wait, doesn't that apply to colonization? This idea of complex trauma being within, like in the context of subordination or control? Yes, indeed it does. This is my idea anyway. But what Judith Lewis Herman was studying was actually women who had survived domestic violence. That was the client group that she was working with. That was the context that she did her research and her studies. And of course, domestic violence is all about control. It's about the abusive partner controlling the other partner. We know with Indigenous women, if we go to a specific Indigenous context, but with all women, that as well, that like the abusive partner will, often take away the phone or monitor phone calls, will often cut off a person from their family or from their friends. It's all about control. It's about, saying this meal is not good enough, creating a fight, always making that person feel like they're not good enough, that they're subordinate to this person that is controlling them, right? So that was Judith Lewis Herman's research, but I really apply it to colonization because that's exactly what, the worst policies of settler colonial society have done to Indigenous peoples, right? Is control and subordination and taking away the power that we once used to have. But we're also going to talk in the next few weeks about self-care and burnout and how to avoid it, some activities and exercises you can use to keep yourself in a state of well-being. So we also need to talk about vicarious trauma. So if you're working with, but also if you're living with someone who's experiencing trauma, there can be a witnessing that takes place, right? So when we're working with or living with someone who's experiencing all of these unresolved emotions, so it could be terror, it could be anger, it could be loss and grief, it could be a lot of fear. When we witness that, we sort of pick it up a little bit. And if we're working with clients, we're hearing their stories. And sometimes this can happen in a community setting as well, when we share our stories with each other, and that's very necessary. It's good that we're doing that. We need to talk about this. Because not talking about it is how kids grow up not knowing how things are the way they are. And that's how one of the ways that intergenerational trauma gets passed down. So, but we do need to be aware that it's that emotional residue. The problem is not hearing other people's stories. The problem is not living with or working with people who are experiencing trauma. The problem with vicarious trauma is when we can't get rid of all of the stuff that we take on. So that's why self-care is so important. And as I say, we will be talking about that in these sessions. So, okay, so I wanted to get into a little bit more ideas around complex trauma. Now, I can't see the chat when I'm sharing slides, so I promise I will check, you know, every few slides. Maybe I'll click off, or when we have our discussion question, which is coming up, I'll check off, I'll you know, check in with the chat and make sure that I address any questions that you have. So I wanted to get more into the idea of complex trauma, because I think it's such a good way to understand colonization and the trauma of colonization specifically. And this comes from me sort of taking the Judith Lewis Herman book and all of the research and the conclusions that she came to. And then also looking at the Aboriginal Healing Foundation and all of the papers that they put out in the 2000s and into the 2010s. And they have a list of everyday impacts of trauma that I've put in my book, Legacy, that came out in 2019. And I think in a subsequent session, I think I also have that as a handout that you can have. I'm not sure which session, but I'll figure it out when I look at the schedule. So, and so what I've done here to look at the effects is looking at what the Aboriginal Healing Foundation says that they've seen when they've done their, you know, Canada-wide, you know, work in communities. I've also considered what I've seen with my work in community. And then I've looked at Judith Lewis Herman and brought that all together to talk about these effects. So what we tend to see with folks who have complex PTSD is this very persistent sort of unease, right? This discomfort of being in the world. And, you know, I've taught clients and even young kids, students, when I was in the classroom, that were like always like just like uncomfortable in their skin, like just twitching, moving around, and just like this discomfort, right? And whenever I notice it, I try to say, what's going on for you right now? And I find that a lot of folks are actually very unaware of how they feel in their bodies at the time. So even though there's this persistent unease or discomfort, it also kind of is paired with this numbness as well. And, you know, I look at my own experience, I was very dissociated from my body until I had a big health crash in the mid-aughts. I was 40 at the time. And I've only really been living in my body for like the last 15 or so years, 15, 16 years. I was completely dissociated because of childhood experiences, right? But I was also always very uncomfortable in my body. So it's weird, right? Because how can it be both? But it is. And I see that with a lot of the folks that I've worked with, that there's this kind of, you know, and sometimes a dysphoria, we're calling it nowadays, where like they don't like their bodies, or they're mad at their bodies. I know I was kind of mad at my body every time I would have a migraine, or every time I'd be like, oh, come on, like, what is this? And I'd sort of be mad at my body. And it's like, well, no, you know, your body's communicating with you that there are things that you need to pay attention to and to heal. And we'll get into that. But it is also paired often with this numbness and dissociation from body as well. I talked a little bit about stories in the previous slide. So there's also kind of a spectrum here with memory that happens with complex trauma. Well, also PTSD as well, where someone can kind of forget the traumatic experience that was beyond their ability to cope, especially if it happened in childhood. Where it's really not a part of their everyday life. It's not something that they think about. It's not something, you know, survivors want to think about either, because it was upsetting and traumatic. So there's like this complete amnesia, and then that becomes kind of difficult, because if there's an unease or a discomfort in everyday life, or a numbness or dissociation, it's hard for the survivor to like figure out, well, like, why am I this way? Because they don't really have any direct memories of what happened in the past. On the other side of the spectrum, though, there are people who can be totally preoccupied with the past. Some survivors are completely preoccupied. And that definitely describes my mother. She's passed now. She died in 2017. But growing up, she told me her stories over and over and over. Totally preoccupied with her victimization, with, you know, the fact that she wasn't told who she was, that she didn't have, you know, her stories. And she was right to be upset about all of those things, of course. But this is one of the ways that trauma becomes intergenerational, right? Is by her telling me over and over and over all the time stories about her past, I wasn't really able to develop my own stories and my own sense of being in the world. I was kind of stuck in my mom's stories, right? Now, in a way, that's also a gift, right? Because I got stories about the family history that have served me well when I've been trying to sort of create a healing narrative. We'll talk about that later. But it's also a bit of a burden on the children of survivors when they're preoccupied with the past and that's all they talk about. It can turn into a burden for the next generations. Complex trauma can also look like, and this is also matching like the Aboriginal Healing Foundation list of, you know, the impacts. This sense of helplessness, right? Because when you're being controlled by a control figure and someone's telling you what to do or what you can't do, you start to say, well, why bother, right? I'm being controlled by somebody, I'm just going to check out, right? And that's understandable, but then that has lingering effects as well, especially on other generations. I know myself, I dealt with a lot of shame and self-blame as well. Those are another couple of things that happen. Because some of my childhood experiences, you know, people actually told me that this is all your fault. You know, they try to gaslight you and convince you that it's you who are the problem, and no, it's not. You're the abuser here. There was a lot of that kind of dysfunction in my family, especially between siblings. So I grew up with a lot of shame and self-blame, and just feeling different from other people. Because when you experience trauma, especially as a child, and some of you will probably have lived experience of this or be working with clients with lived experience like this. You start to function at a very, you know, adult level, even though you're a child. And it makes you feel very different from your peers. Even though you want to, you know, be closer with your peers, what you've experienced, it's so different from people who have not experienced trauma that you can start to feel like nobody understands you. And then that makes you want to isolate, which is actually the opposite of what we need to do to heal, which is create relationships, but we'll get there. A lot of time with complex trauma, we accept the perpetrator, the abusers, the control figure's belief system. And that helps us rationalize the abuse. And I know it's weird to say that because like who would want to rationalize away when someone's abusing you? But that's one of those coping mechanisms, right? That's one of our survival skills that helps us actually survive the abuse, is that, oh, well, you know, what they're saying is right. You start to accept what they say. So whether it's the government of Canada saying horrible things about Indigenous cultures, you know, oh, you didn't have technology or science, or you're just this, you're just that, I won't repeat them. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes we internalize that and we start to believe it. And we say, oh, okay, I'm going to try to be what they want me to be. And then maybe they'll like me. Or if it's in the family, there's a control figure, an abuser. If it's a parent, for example, or grandparent, whoever, or sibling, sometimes we accept that because we want them to love us. And so if we accept that and rationalize away, this is an abuse, this is, you know, I need to be this way because then maybe they'll love me. It's some crazy convoluted stuff that happens. Like they're literally getting in your head. That's what the whole control thing is about. And that's why it creates, you know, this incredible burden of trauma going forward in life. I spoke a little bit there around, you know, my mother's stories kind of, you know, not allowing me to develop my own identity. And that is true of so many survivors. There's sort of an inability to form your identity when you're being controlled by someone else and being told how to be or who you are, right? You know, colonized, you know, the dominant society lectures Indigenous peoples all the time about how and who we should be, right? And we're going to talk about removal and loss of culture and identity in a few slides. So I won't go into that too much at this point, but that's one of the effects of complex trauma, that control is that loss or removal of identity. I see this with a lot of clients that I've worked with and some of the kids that I've worked with as well, that experiencing complex trauma really leads to, and I mentioned isolation. So isolation and withdrawal is certainly a thing, but it also leads to a sense of distrust of the entire world, right? And sometimes because we don't have an identity, we've been prevented from, you know, forming that healthy identity because of being controlled by someone, then we kind of search for someone to rescue us from it. Because we do know that it's unfair or wrong. At some level, we do know that what's happening to us is not okay. But we don't know because we haven't formed identity, or we've, you know, in the case of colonization, because cultural ways of healing have been removed in some or many cases, we don't think that we can do that work of healing ourselves. So we search for someone to rescue us, right? And that can put us into unsafe situations. Yeah. Oops, I get a big sound from my, now, this mostly comes from the Aboriginal Healing Foundation listed impacts. The sense of hopelessness and despair that happened when, you know, Indigenous people signed treaties in some places in Canada or made agreements with someone, and then we were cheated on that. And we were still moved to, you know, the worst part of like our traditional territory or somewhere that we weren't even from, right? It leads to this sense of hopelessness and despair when, you know, these colonial policies and practices keep controlling our lives. It really leads to a sense of voicelessness, an inability to speak truth over time. You just feel like, what is the point? Because nothing's going to change, right? And then when we have a control figure, especially like, you know, a colonial government telling us that we're inferior culturally or we're lesser than other people, unfortunately, a lot of the time we can tend to believe that. We really internalize that, right? And then sometimes we put that on subsequent generations, sometimes our own children or, you know, other family members, as I've said. Now, one of the interesting things, and I don't mean to be weird, you know, saying interesting, but it's, I guess I say interesting because my own healing journey has been so much about learning how to set boundaries. That's because when you're under someone else's control and they're inside your head convincing you of all sorts of things, and they're being abusive and they're doing things to rob you of voice and agency and all of that stuff, you want to please them because you want to avoid conflict or being punished or whatever it is, right? So it becomes really, really difficult to set boundaries and to be able to say, that's not okay. I'm not having this conversation with you. Like those kinds of things, and I have seen it in clients, but I also speak from a very personal experience as well, that is really hard for people who have always been under someone else's control and trying to please that control figure, right? Setting boundaries is important to healing, but it's really impossible with people who are experiencing complex PTSD. I mentioned that feeling powerlessness and the lack of agency, you know, when you're under someone's control, but what that looks like also in terms of someone's mental or spiritual development is that, you know, survivors feel like they can't change their lives or shape the world around us because we don't feel like we have power or agency, right? And a lot of times when opportunities do come our way, there's such a fear of failure that we can often self-sabotage. That can happen in relationships, it can happen in school opportunities, education opportunities, it can happen in the workplace. And I think sometimes it can happen to a certain extent on a whole community level, where, you know, a new organization opens up, but then there's infighting in the board, and then there's this, and then, you know, a toxic workplace, the bosses aren't treating the workers well, and the whole thing falls apart, right? I think a lot of us have been there. I think that's self-sabotage at the community level, right? And it all comes from all of this stuff, this unresolved stuff, all of this stuff, that unresolved emotions, but not having voice, not feeling like we can change it, lack of agency, and really a lack of awareness about all of this even existing, right? So that's why, you know, I live my life trying to do this work, because the more people know about this stuff, then they can say, ah, oh, you know, I think what's happening here is blank, right? When we experience complex trauma, we start to have ideas about ourselves and about the world around us, right? So some of the most common ones that I have seen, and I'm sure you have as well, is that the world is unsafe. Survivors the world is an unsafe place. So it means they don't want to be in the world. It means they're afraid of the world. It means they're mad at the world. The world is unsafe. Another common is no one will help me. No one will help me, because that's what they've experienced. Now, that's not true. There might be other people who can help them, but they're convinced that no one will help them because that's been some or most of their experience, and they get locked into that mindset. They get really stuck there. And I know I experienced that because I became very self-reliant. Like, if you got to get through something or figure your way out of something, you're going to have to do it yourself, girl. And I was really bad at asking for help. Oh, really bad. Until like probably 10 or 12 years ago. And when I realized that, oh, my friends really do want to help me. Oh, I had no idea, right? Very unfortunately, I've had friends, colleagues, clients, and students say, oh, who cares? I'm just going to die young anyway. Or I'm just going to die anyway. There's this sense of, you know, not being able to change your life path, that you feel like, you know, life is not, and I'm not talking about suicidal ideation, but just this sense that, you know, certain things are inevitable, especially if you've seen it around you, that there are people who have suicidal ideation, and then you start to say, well, that probably happened to me too. I'm just going to die. And sometimes, especially childhood, but not always childhood, when you're having, you know, when there is a traumatic episode, sometimes people will threaten you with that, you know, shh, don't talk about this or I'll kill you, or all those horrible things. If you internalize that, then you start to believe it. Even though you're away from that person and maybe the danger is over, still your mind, your spirit will be saying, you know, I'm just going to die anyway. And that really affects how you live in the world, obviously, right? A sense of like just fatalism, you know. A lot of folks also don't trust anyone, because anytime you do trust anyone, they're gonna screw you over, right? Excuse my, you know, kind of everyday language there, but that's the thought process, right? And that is, you can't think that and create healthy relationships. And relationships are how we heal. So, right? This too is very common when you experience complex trauma. I know I experienced it myself. I've seen it with all of my clients and students. This idea that, and you say it to yourself in your head, sometimes even without hearing it, it's like this subconscious way of being in the world, that I'm not worthy of love. I'm not worthy of respect. And with that also, I don't know anything. No, I don't know anything. And it's just like erasure. It's self-erasure, because at the time of the traumatic incident, you were also erased, right? Or told that you were nothing. Or like colonization has told Indigenous peoples for generations now, that our science, our medicine, our ways of governance, whatever, you know, you're nothing. you don't know anything. And we carry that through. And that has an effect on our spirit, our way of being in the world. Now, we have a discussion question coming up, but I wanted to talk about some of the effects that all of this has on us before we consider our question. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the effects of trauma on health, because that's a big thing that we see in our communities, in our families. As I've mentioned, I had a big health crash, as I call it, in the mid-aughts, and I was not a well person for most of my adult life. And now for the last 15 years, I finally have achieved that, and it is miraculous when you actually start feeling well. And you don't know that you're necessarily not feeling well at the time until you get well, and then you go, oh my heavens, like this is different, this is good. And this is from various sources. I have all of my citations and sources in the book in Legacy, so I don't put it on my slides, it's just too much. But if you want to know where I got all of this research, just check the sources at the back of Legacy. And Legacy and the new book, Killing the Wendigo, are in libraries as well, so you can take it out for free. There's a lot of headaches with survivors of trauma, right? A lot of headaches. There's a lot of back pain, a lot of gut disturbance. My mother had that, a lot of stomach aches, and just chronic overall pain. I know when I was in university, just the stresses of all the unresolved stuff I was carrying, all those feelings of worthlessness, but at trying to get good marks and be like the perfect student and all of this stuff. I went to the emergency room a couple times because I just felt pain everywhere in my body. I was like, I must be dying. Like, what is wrong with me? And of course, Western medicine was like, well, we've done blood tests, we've done this, nothing's broken, there's nothing wrong with you. And then they tell you it's in your head. Well, no, it's actually trauma living in my body, but we'll get there. So and that's that sort of discomfort of the body. A lot of digestive issues, including like elimination, so bowel movements, and also disruption in sleep is very common with people who've experienced trauma. Then there's also this kind of spectrum between like malnutrition, when people don't care for themselves enough, and they're not getting, they don't, engage in the self-care of creating a healthy meal and sitting down and eating it. They're not feeding themselves, and sometimes even their children enough. And that's not really the poverty thing. It's sometimes when there is food in the house, but you just you're not in that place where you realize that I am deserving of a healthy meal. I'm deserving of sitting down at a table with my family and enjoying the gifts of the earth. A survivor who doesn't believe that they're worth anything doesn't think that they're worthy of that kind of care, even self-care, right? So sometimes there's not enough food coming in, but then obesity is actually a form of malnutrition, because it's, sugar, salt, and fat, all of that processed food that we've been peddled by the corporations, all of this stuff. And of course, you all know, we used to have an amazingly healthy diet. Wild herbs, wild onions, wild ginger, all of the plants, the different leaves, different times of the year. I know when I was living out east, fiddleheads, right? Or in the mountains, we had, they used to be called Jerusalem artichokes, but now I think most people are calling them sunchokes. And they're a root vegetable, right? We had wild beets. We had so many things. We had all of the meats, the animals on the land, of course, the fish, healthy water. And now we're eating like white flour and white sugar. And I know I used to eat that way until I stopped, right? So even though we gain weight from those things, we're actually kind of malnourished because we're not getting the nutrition that we need, right? And if we have poor digestion, then even if we do eat healthy food, sometimes we're actually not getting the benefit of that nutrition. It just passes through us. So that's the poor digestion, elimination, because there's a lot of irritable bowel syndrome is what Western medicine calls it. But that's one of the effects of trauma on health. Toxic stress, living in a colonized society and settler colonial society, having to deal with microaggressions at work, having to deal with lateral violence at work, family issues, no support for healing, trying to do different for your kids, all of these toxic, stressful things that we live with as survivors of colonization. It leads, and this is even Western medicine, not that I need Western medicine to back up everything that we know or that trauma theorists know, but I'm just saying, even Western medicine recognizes the effect of toxic stress on health. It leads to body-wide inflammation, can lead to hormonal imbalances. And that inflammation and those hormonal imbalances actually lead to autoimmune diseases. But I like to say dis-ease, because that's more about how we would as Indigenous peoples. And I don't want to be pan-Indigenous because we're different. We have different cultures, different ways of understanding, different values. But, we're similar enough that I think we all agree that balance is key, right? And so we have a dis-ease from surviving the trauma, right? And that can lead to autoimmune, where our own bodies are attacking ourselves. So all of these diseases that we're seeing now, from diabetes to arthritis to PCOS is polycystic ovarian syndrome. We have rising rates of cancer in the Indigenous community today, whereas once it was almost unknown. And we have rising rates of dementia. My mom died of Alzheimer's in 2017 after many decades of cognitive changes. And again, we used to have, well, we still do, of course, but we used to have a society based on the wisdom of the elders. We were very long-lived. These are all new things that have come about after colonization, right? So that's the autoimmune, the effect, and it's leading to all of these like life-changing situations. There's also, and there was a question here about, triggers. I can't remember exactly what they said in their question, but it's for next session, but it's kind of related to this around when we respond, when we carry all these unresolved emotions, it affects our mental health in a way that we can, as I've said, dissociate from our bodies or from the memories of what happened to us. We can isolate, as I said. We can also reenact, which is when we sort of, like a reenactment is like when you've experienced something like, you're told something about yourself, let's say you're a bad person, you're not worthy of love, ugh, horrible thing. I don't even want to repeat that. But if we hear that from someone who's abusing us, whether it's a colonial control figure or a family abuser, intergenerational, whatever it is, or maybe lateral violence from a workplace, whatever it is, then sometimes we take that into the relationships that we have in our life away from that situation. And we're sort of reenacting where we get into like conflict with that other situation because we're trying to prove to them that I am worth something. I'm not. And we're like sort of reenacting the fight or the situation with that control figure in the rest, in other areas in our life, but we're not conscious of that. And so it creates, because we feel voiceless and like we can't stand up to the control figure, then we take it into other places in our life. And sometimes we take it to the person that we actually feel really comfortable with, because we know that we can like be truthful with them because they're our safe person. They might be our partner or our best friend, but we're reenacting that power dynamic with them. And so it's like we go into other areas of our life and we reenact, which creates problems in our, other relationships, right? But it's all related to the 4 Fs. Now, I know most of you have probably heard of the 3 Fs, the freeze, flight, and fight. So when something happens and it's like, traumatic incident coming, we either freeze up, like, voicelessness, can't move, can't talk, can't defend ourselves, can't, and that was my thing. I used to do that all the time. We flight, we run, or we don't go back to school, or we run from a relationship or whatever it is, or we fight, right? Or with our words, we fight. But complex trauma, there's a new F that people, everyone, you know, trauma theorists are talking about today, and that's called fawn. So that's when we have that control figure, that abusive figure, you know, and we want to avoid being punished. We want them to love us if it's a family member or whatever it is. And we become people pleasers. So imagine a little Bambi, like a little fawn, like, oh, and just making ourselves cute and please don't hurt me because I want to please you. And that's a response. And that, of course, also affects our health. That's why I put it here in health, because when we're constantly people pleasing, we're not taking care of ourselves. And that means that, you know, our mental, spiritual, and emotional health, we're not giving it the attention that it needs. So that really affects our way of being in the world. So we've got our 4 F's response to the control figure as well. But it does affect our health. It's not just like a phenomenon, it has effects on our body and on our spirits. So we finally arrive at the discussion question, and then I'll open the chat after this. And I like posing this question because it gets us understanding where our resiliences are too, because I start with the hard stuff, but I don't want you guys to think that we should, or I do, or any of us, you know, we shouldn't approach any of our work through a deficit lens. And then that's what we're going to move into the next half hour. The last bit of our time is being trauma informed, right? So our question for discussion is, other ethnic or cultural groups, however you want to describe it, have experienced collective trauma, you know, a war or colonization, and even genocide, which is all about being controlled, right? Or having, you know, that sort of, not just PTSD, but a complex PTSD where it's about subordination and control. Other groups have experienced that. So why has it been so difficult for Indigenous peoples in the Americas to heal from the trauma of colonization? How do we explain this? I've had amazing conversations with survivors of the Armenian genocide. I taught Kurdish students in a school once, and I talked with their parents. I've had these conversations. So why has it been so difficult for us, for Indigenous peoples, if you're not Indigenous, to heal from the trauma of colonization? And I'm going to leave that question with you. Feel free to take a quick screenshot if you think you need to read it again. I'm going to click off the share and I'm going to open the chat here as well. But take a minute and just think that through, and we will discuss. Okay. So let me click open. And while you're thinking, I'll check on the questions. Oh, and I see where you're all from. Awesome. Oh, so many people from so many different, ooh. And usually, oh, and I see, thank you. You've sent the schedule, Manisha, thank you. Because I'm like, which session is it? Thank you, everybody, for being here. Now I'll see, these could be just all of your introductions. I just want to make sure before we get into our discussion that you actually don't have questions. Oh, I'm getting into some questions here. There you go. You're starting to answer. Yes. Oh. Uh-oh, I just clicked on 34 new and now I have to scroll all the way back up for some weird reason. Okay, here we are. Okay, here we go. Sorry for all that. I had to scroll back up. So someone has posted here, yes, my mom blamed me and I am the baby. And a lot of you, some of you have hearted that. Thank you for that, because it took me a minute to get to our questions here. Exactly. When people are really stuck in their stories, and all of this relates to our discussion questions, so it's fine that we have this discussion and then we hit back on our question, and I know some of you started answering the question too. Yeah, that's what happens when people are in their victimization, is that then they project it on other people, right? And I'm sorry to hear that, and we're all working on our healing. And so, and another same comment, I was blamed my entire child. I can't talk all of a sudden. My entire childhood. Now I'm the black sheep. Yes, the only one in post-secondary ever in my family. I see you and hear you, my sister. Yes, indeed. I have 2 half siblings. We are completely estranged. They just, you know, they don't want to have the discussion about what happened in our family. And I see here in this comment that I was blamed my entire childhood. Now, I don't know your story, but that resonates with me, my story, because, and there's something I want to raise here around family dysfunction, which is that and many of you might have already, you know, encountered this in your work or in your healing journey, your life so far, that we take on roles in families, right? And there's lists online you can get, and I've had them in other sessions. I should bring them back for next time, but where, you know, there's always someone in the family who's the scapegoat, right? I was that person in my family. Yay, let's blame it all on Suzanne. Great. And it was because I kept wanting to talk about stuff. And they were all like, what are you talking about? Right? And then it just became impossible for me. Oh, the next person being the scapegoat is a lonely life. I guess I should read a little bit more ahead. Thank you. Irish Jane is posted. Yeah. It can be, can't it? It can be lonely. I wish I had siblings. I do. But I know myself and many of us, we have chosen family as well, right? So I wish for you, and I hope for you, that you found that. But even though we have chosen family, and I'm speaking only for myself here, there can still be that undercurrent of loneliness, right? Because other people have families to go to at a holiday, or, you know, and we don't. Yeah, it's different for us. But, you know, again, just speaking only for myself, and we don't always have to think the same, right? I think there's something about the freedom of being away from being attacked and blamed all the time, that, you know, I'll take the occasional feeling of loneliness because at least I'm free. I'm free from that, right? And that's me setting a boundary. Remember I talked about boundaries? So it's like, yay, me, because I realized that, no, I'm not going to let you treat me this way anymore. And you're believing wrong things, and you're saying wrong things, and so that's my boundary. So I'll take that freedom, even when I feel the loneliness. Yeah. Yes. How the colonization has, you know, told us and our families that we're worthless. Yeah. Someone has put here about the survivor's guilt. Yeah. Yeah. We feel like, how have I survived when so many of us have dealt with multiple losses of people in our lives? Yeah, I hear you. Harry has posted, somebody once said to me when they were sad that I have a case of the colonialisms. Haha, I love that. Yes, accurate on so many levels when you consider health broadly. Exactly. Because they have it as, oh, today I had a migraine case of the colonialisms. You know what? I might steal that. So whoever that person was that told you that, I think, yes.
I just have a thought.
Yeah.
The roles and responsibilities that we play in these last 50 or whatever years were westernized, because the roles and responsibilities, what I'm learning that come with Indigenous people, are so different. Are like, we all played the role of a mom, like, or an auntie. And so times have changed where we're labeling ourselves as the scapegoat, the rebel, or whatever, because that was the colonial thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's us to change those roles. And I've reminded people in my family, now that I'm learning them, Like, it shouldn't be a burden for you to watch your nephew or to help watch him, especially we have a lot of special needs kids these days. And I had to remind my family of that, because back in the day, we didn't complain about it. We would have just helped out because there was no such thing as an orphan or a foster parent. That's all made up stuff through colonialism. And it's sad that some of us are just understanding and learning this,
Yeah.
but it's never too late to learn it.
Yep. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think, and that is, we're going to be talking about that next session. This idea of we have these beliefs, oh, and then the labels come, as you say, I'm the scapegoat, or I'm the this, or I'm the, you know, and how do we sort of bring that around, that we're not like labeling ourselves, and that we can get back to deciding who we want to be and what our story is. Thank you for that. Okay, so I see some answers to that discussion question. Kaylin has said, you know, we haven't, you know, been able to get over this because we've experienced a different type of colonization, which is settler colonization. Yes, where they colonized us and never left. Exactly. So we have this dominant society here in Canada controlling us. And, you know, whether it's Indian Act control, your status on reserve, or whether it's, you know, rural or urban, Métis, Inuit, whatever, there are still all sorts of ways in which the dominant society controls us, whether it's in post-secondary education or in the healthcare system or child welfare system, like, you know, it's all around us. Yeah, they never left, and it's continuing. Absolutely. Stephanie says no supports. Is it Rolando or Roland? I'm not sure if that's your middle initial or part of your first name. I like Rolando. Lynching, yes. You guys are brilliant, by the way, because some people don't get, you know, all of these pieces of it. Yeah, our medicine people and our leaders, so many of them were killed. And then when a community is left without leaders or without knowledge keepers or without medicine people, the knowledge and the cross-generational knowledge transfer, it's impossible for us to get well if all of those things are at once, all of a sudden removed, right? Absolutely. Ramona says genocidal policies are still alive today. Yes, colonization, because they never left, the ongoing policies and practices as well. Monique says systemic racism, absence of substantive equality. Yes. And that's the complex trauma burden, right? Is all of that control over top of us when we're, you know, and other marginalized people, by the way. You know, you could be a newcomer, racialized, you could be, you know, a lot of different people other than Indigenous people experiences in Canada, where there's just racism embedded in the systems and institutions because there's no equity and there's no equality, right? Equity is about giving people what they need, which means that different people will get different things. And equality is understanding that we are all equal as sacred beings in the universe, right? Thank you for that. And Carrie says, yeah, because settler colonialism is an ongoing colonial project. It has not ended. Yes. Is it Sarai? I'm sorry about pronunciations. If I don't get them, please excuse me. Has added, yes, because it has not stopped. It still lives in society. Absolutely. Irish Jane says they took our language. Yes. So some of the cultural concepts and some of the ways that we would communicate, you know, oral tradition relates to language, right? So yeah, all of these ways that, you know, they took away the methods and modalities that we would have used for healing. Oh, and thank you, Manisha, for putting the question in the chat. Tiffany says, because existing persistent policies still embody control over how Indigenous people operate and organize. Ooh, I like how you've written that. Yeah, it's not just existing, it's persistent, and it's not just about control, but it's about they embody the entire theory of control. And that's interesting, the addition there of organize. I like that. Because it's not just how we operate in daily life, it's how we organize to resist even. You know, look at what the federal police did when they busted the Wet'suwet'en, you know, and that pipeline just went through, right? If we organize to resist, even if we organize to create, you know, a healing program, oh, well, then you can be sure they're going to cut the funding at some point, right? Yeah, that's a really good point. Ramona is saying government's still using money to create dependency. Ooh, that's a great idea. I mean, not what's happening, but pointing it out. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. We don't have time to get into it today, really, but you know, maybe I can add to it in following sessions, because capitalism is so much a part of colonization, right? And colonialism ongoing, that they make us dependent on these systems. And whether it's the processed food, or whether it's, you know, having to work for a living instead of walk your healing path. There's a book, and I haven't read it yet, but the title is Give People Money. And I haven't read it yet, but it's been well reviewed. And it's all about this idea of a universal basic income, because capitalism just keeps us prisoner to these colonial systems, because we have to work for the man, or, you know, bow and scrape at a welfare office, or at an employment insurance office, or wherever, the benefits office, disability office, wherever their bureaucracy tells us to go. And that interferes with our ability to act, you know, to develop a voice and to develop agency. That's a great addition. Thank you. Marissa says, because colonization still exists, assimilation of our peoples is still ongoing. Yeah, it is, unfortunately. Lack of education and knowledge from other ethnic groups. Ooh, that's an important point too. And you know, the government has very deliberately done that, hey, with like their immigration test booklets and everything. They don't put the true history of the country in there. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Oh, and somebody said she signed in late. So I can just say the recording will be available later, and I will share the slides. So don't worry about that. Just breathe and be with us for when you can. Is it Krister says, I feel like it's hard to forgive and forget, but if we all learn to forgive and choose not to carry the burden anymore, then we may reach complete healing. I'm with you on that, if it works for you. The concept of forgiveness doesn't work for some people, right? And in my latest book, Killing the Wittigo, which is a young adult version of Legacy, I talked about this idea of forgiveness. Why is it our job to forgive the abuser? Like, why are we responsible for everything, right? But there are some people who say, as you know, this person has says that, you know, by forgiving, I let them, like, I get them out of my, they're not taking up space inside of me anymore. I totally get that. But some people say it hasn't worked for them. And you know, when the Pope visit and everything, and oh Lord, we had so many discussions about forgiveness versus, you know, just political change. And I think that's a conversation, but you know what? If it works for you, use what works for you, because we're all different and we'll all respond to different things. So thank you for that. Is it Leah has said neo-colonialism? Yes, new forms of colonialism disguised not to look like colonialism. Melissa says we haven't healed in part because the trauma has not been fully acknowledged. Yes, I do think, you know, when I started researching and writing Legacy, it was around 2013-ish. It was published in 2019. And I didn't hear anybody really talking about intergenerational trauma, not in the classroom, not in media. And I think what really was the TRC report, right? When it came out 2015 with the survivor testimony, I think we really started opening up to talking about this stuff. But I think there's still, as Melissa says, a lot of talking that still needs to happen. And a lot of folks still aren't comfortable discussing it. I know I've been very happy that the 2 books I've just written have been well received by people inside community and without, and I'm very, very grateful to that, because I want my work to make a difference. I want it to be the way that I contribute to community, and I'm glad that it's been received well. But I know I've had a few people say, oh, trauma, you know, they're not ready. They're not ready for the books. They're not ready for the conversation. And we do need to acknowledge it, yeah. Carrie, they still uncovered the truth. Yeah, the truth of the situation is still being covered up. Yeah, and Ramona is the same idea. People are unaware of the historic trauma. Yeah. Yeah, there's still conversations we need to have. Now, let's see. Historic trauma. Okay, generational trauma is still very prevalent. The lack of supports. It's hard to overcome such a huge part of history. Yes. Well, you guys are stars. I mean, you know, oh, someone else has added the racist attitudes and assumptions that still exist to this day. Yeah, we can't heal when we're dealing with, you know, huge things and also microaggressions every day, right? Kim has said systemic abuse and denial in both government, education, and societal organizations. Absolutely. Jessica has said, because our people are still fighting for their rights and land, we're still being oppressed. Our land isn't ours, and the land is so important for our people for so many reasons. Absolutely. And that's why, you know, capitalism and federal police and everything else and the systems and institutions. We want equity. I don't know whether the dominant society is ever really going to let us be equal. We'll see. I have hope. Iris Jane says, having a connection to creator and letting creator be my sponsor really helped me. Yeah, when we're doing our healing work, we find our ways. I know that I've developed like a spiritual practice around ancestral, you know, stuff. I'll just say that, you know, that feeling like, you know, especially as I said, as the other person pointed out, like if you don't have an intact family, feeling like I do have a family. I mean, they're in the spirit world, but it's still family, right? And feeling their love and their guidance. Yeah, there's something about connecting to creation. So I think that's about it for the answers, and we'll get into like trauma informed stuff for our last 10 minutes together. And someone else has said we're still controlled. Yeah. So let me go back to share screen for our last few minutes together. And I hope you can all see that now. So yeah, you all raised everything on this slide. So congratulations, because a lot of the time, you know, people don't get all of this, that it's ongoing, that we were removed from the land, that the loss of our leaders and our knowledge keepers and our medicine people, the removal or replacement of our ways of knowing, being, teaching, learning, our science and medicine, removal from culture, ongoing. I mean, you just got it all. So, I mean, congratulations, you are stars. So for our last few minutes together, I want to end today with the idea of what does it mean to be trauma informed, because it's not, it's on the one hand, quite difficult. You have to do it a lot before it becomes like second nature, You need a lot of time and hours put in to learn it. But on the other hand, it's really not difficult. But I want to start being trauma informed with this idea of resilience after trauma. And so many of you have raised that in your comments. And thank you for being vulnerable and open to this discussion today. You're all amazing. Thank you. And I want to ground us in this idea of resilience after trauma, that survivors are highly skilled often in how, and I'm going to say I'm a survivor as well, in how we view the world, how we engage with the world. We develop ways to be in the world that shows how smart and skilled we are, right? That we survived. We have great problem-solving skills, a lot of us. We tend to become, well, some of us, most of us, many of us, I guess it depends. Some survivors can become very adaptable people. Where, okay, this is the latest weirdness in life. How do we get through this? Because we're used to weirdness, you know, that's resiliency. We can often have a lot of empathy for the experiences of others, and also a sense of responsibility for creating change. And that can be creating change in the family. It can be in our workplace. It can be society, wherever that sense of responsibility is aimed at. And a lot of us work well under pressure because we're used to living in toxic stress, right? So we have great resiliencies, many of us, after experiencing trauma. So by starting with the heavy stuff, I don't want us to be in some sort of deficit lens, right? Because we are resilient and intelligent and creative, and we problem solve. The fact that Indigenous peoples, that we're still alive, shows how awesome and resilient we are. But resiliency is not healing, right? So I want us over the next 4 weeks to get from talking about resiliencies and then get into activities, exercises, ideas on what healing is. So to start that, our last few minutes now today, we need to start by reframing the question. So instead of what's wrong with you, if you're looking at someone else, or sometimes it's, oh, what's wrong with me, if we're looking at ourselves, that's blaming. That doesn't help. That doesn't help us be trauma informed, and it doesn't help us get from resiliency to healing. We need to shift the question and reframe it so that what we're asking is, what happened to you? Or what happened to me? We need to get to explaining, and that's how we get to healing. Okay, and again, I'll send these slides around so you can have that slide. So trauma-informed approaches. Trauma-informed approaches are, it's not a checklist, it's not a set of rules, it's not like one thing that you do, it's not like that. It's like a values-based system, so it should be familiar to any Indigenous person who's studying culture approaches, because, you know, our cultures are very heavily values-based. Being trauma-informed is about creating safe and empowering spaces. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. One of the ways you can do that is by helping a survivor, whether it's a client or a family member, your child, whoever, change the way that they view themselves and the world around them. So remember all of those questions and the things that we say in our head from complex trauma? Oh, I'm just going to die anyway. I don't know anything. I'm not worthy of love and respect. The world is unsafe. No one will help me. All of those trauma-related gronk that we need to get out of our bodies and our minds and our spirits. When we help survivors change that sort of internal narrative, change the way they view themselves and the world around them, we're being trauma informed by definition. And that change can happen different ways. And we're going to get into that next week. When we support survivors in regaining a sense of control over their lives, because control, of course, complex trauma, you all just said it in the chat, we're still being controlled in settler colonial society. When we help survivors regain a sense of control, we're being trauma informed, because we're answering back to that lack of control from the control figure or the abuser. So it's not really a what, and I guess it's kind of a what, but it's like a how to the what. It's how we do things. Relationship building is key. That's part of Judith Lewis Herman's research on complex trauma. I think that's key to Indigenous culture-based systems, whether it's the medicine wheel, whether it's longhouse teachings, whether it's, you know, whatever ceremonies you might participate in, whether it's a drum circle or a Sundance or a moon ceremony for women or a fast, whatever it is, relationships. Those things bring us into relationship with the spirit world, the land, other people, and ourselves, our deepest sense of self, right? When we do that, we are being trauma informed. when we build relationships, we also help people build self-awareness. Because if I'm in a relationship with someone, I know that I have a responsibility to them. Then that makes me, when I'm not with that person, or sometimes when I'm with them, say, ooh, what do I owe this person right now in this moment in terms of my behavior or in terms of my care? What do I owe myself in terms of boundaries or in terms of, right? That self-awareness comes from the reciprocity of relationships. I think that the blaming to explaining piece, that no judgment, instead of what's wrong with you, that's very judgy. What happened to you is no judgment. Just what happened to you? What's your story? How do we help you re-story? And we're getting into that next week. It's that unconditional positive regard that, you know, is the foundation for being trauma. Strengths-based again. So taking into account those resiliencies, even as we talk about coping mechanisms and intergenerational trauma being passed down. Understanding resiliencies and strengths is just key, and understanding that people will be on the journey to healing and will be in a different place, right? You know, from day to day, from year to year, and just no judgment. So I have another couple of slides, but I note that it's 11:32. So if you have to go, please feel free to get on with your day. If you have another 5-7 minutes maybe, but hopefully 5, I'll get through these last slides, and of course I'll show the slides. So you do what you need to do. But for those who can stay, I'll get us through the last few in the next very short minutes. I promise I'll try not to talk too much. So there are culture-based approaches. Yeah, I know. We'll see how that works. Culture-based approaches for healing. Now I can only speak from my own cultural knowledge. So as a Nehio person, as a Cree person, then I'm going to speak about like social relationships, kinship, right? But you, in whatever culture you are in, you will know what your framework and your word language term is, and your system for kinship and relations, right? But relations is a wide sort of, kinship is a wide understanding for all Indigenous peoples, right? We have personal responsibility in terms of our actions. A lot of that comes down to showing gratitude. Gratitude has been really key to bringing me and a lot of people that I've worked with, a lot of my friends, you know, bringing us out of that victimization space and bringing us toward the new story, restorying that we're going to talk about next week, showing gratitude and not being stuck in the story of the bad things that happened to us. Even though it's okay, we need to tell those stories. And it did happen. Showing gratitude helps us kind of get unstuck. We need to have a healthy spirit. So there's ways we can do that. And the activities and exercises over the next 4 weeks, are going to help us do that. Also the health of land. We have a responsibility to the land. There's things that, I mean, we don't have time to get into it now, but over the next 3 weeks, we'll come back to this idea, okay? On why the health of the land is actually also about our health. It's just that sense of belonging, and our kinship with the land. Most Indigenous peoples talk about harmony and balance as well, whether it's a medicine wheel model, whether it's whatever model you use in your particular culture, region, community. But even though we talk about balance and we have models, a lot of those models, and for me, again, as a Cree person, I'm thinking about the medicine wheel, those models say that yes, we need harmony, we need balance between like the 4 quadrants on the medicine wheel, but we also need to keep an eye toward continuity at the same time, like what we've inherited, spirit memory, family stories, you know, understanding our history, whatever it is. But we also need to look at change. Healing is about change, transformative change. That's how I define it. We're going to talk over the next few weeks around different definitions of what healing means. And no definition is wrong. They can mean all of those things. But change is really key, right? And I think I've already said that connection to self, to others, to the natural world, to the spirit world. Being trauma informed and focusing on relationships helps us do all of this. And some of the activities and exercises we're going to be doing will use cultural models such as the medicine wheel. And of course, you'll have your own, or maybe you can investigate them. But there are definite cultural approaches to healing. And I know they've worked for me, and I've seen them work for other people as well. There's more to culture-based healing, though. It's not just those frameworks or values-based systems. We also have the idea that food is medicine, right? All of the time that I've been to medicine people, they've said, try to eat this food, or, you should be doing this. Like, what we take into our bodies is literally the universe. It's the sun, the wind, the soil, the microbes in the soil, it's the critters, the worms in the soil, it's the groundwater, it's the rain, it's the labor of the person who grew it, it's everything. That eating is ceremony, actually. So food can be medicine. We'll get in that more into that in the self-care section. Plant medicines, I know have been really transformative for my healing journey, and I've seen them work for other people as well. I was lucky when I was living in Toronto to have access to Anishinaabe Health Toronto, which is an Indigenous healing center. They've got a couple of different locations now, and back in the 90s, it was just one little storefront at Queen and Sherbourne in Toronto. But they had, medicine people coming down from Manitoulin Island and from other places, and they would prescribe plant medicines. And these were guys who had studied 20, 30, 40, 50 years to learn what they did. It's a real commitment to community to learn that knowledge and to pass it on. And I know that plant medicine has been very, very healing for me. There's doctoring as well, which medicine people do. We can talk about that later if anybody has questions. And I mentioned this before, ceremony, fasting, singing, drumming, sweat lodge, sun dance, whatever it is that you practice, that helps get energy unstuck. It helps change energy flow. It helps with detoxing. And sometimes plant medicines can also bring us to a situation where we actually purge, like sometimes vomiting or sometimes out the other end, right? And all of that is about getting all that unresolved emotion that's stuck in our bodies out, right? So healing isn't easy. Healing through the body, but in Indigenous ideas of healing, it would be mind, body, spirit, emotion together. But through the body, it can be a little bit like, whoa, what is going on here? But in my own healing journey, I never felt scared because I knew that this was deep work of change and that my ancestors were with me. So I would encourage people to, if they have access to medicine people or plant medicines or naturopaths or even traditional Chinese medicine, it's very similar to Indigenous medicine. So far as I've experienced, acupuncture works wonders. Their plant medicine works as well. It's, different plants than ours, but it's the same idea, right? This is all about what it means to take a culture-based approach, is to say thank you to those plants that Mother Earth gives us and to use them to become well, to do our own work through ceremony, to create new stories, which again, we're going to talk about next week, and just get unstuck and get going on change and movement. Yeah. And that's the last slide for today. So I'll stop the share. And I think, because I've gone over time, I won't go back to the chat, but what Manisha will do, she always sends me the chat. So if there's any questions or anything that, because I can't fit them in today, I will revisit them at the beginning of next week's session, okay? Just to be mindful of time. I don't want to keep you too much over time because I know you're all very busy. And if anybody has a question that they can't, I see people saying that was a good discussion. Y'all are the bomb.